Welcome back to Horrifying Stories. In April 2008, a grandfather rushed a sick girl to the hospital. She was critically ill. Doctors could not figure out the cause of the girl's illness, and no one in the family knows anything about her medical condition. This episode is one of the most disturbing cases we've covered. And this is their horrifying story. Viewer discretion is advised. A 19-year-old girl named Kirsten was brought to the emergency department by her grandfather, Elisabeth Fritzl. She was looking very pale and was having problems with her kidneys. Because of how critical her condition was, the doctor decided to put her in a medical coma. In order for doctors to treat her condition correctly, they needed to find out her medical history. So, they went straight to the person who brought her to the hospital, her grandfather, Elisabeth Fritzl. When they started to ask Joseph, he told them that Kirsten was just left outside their door by her daughter, Elisabeth Fritzl, who ran away years back. She left a note saying that she could not afford to bring Kirsten to the hospital and wanted them to take care of her. The doctors were left puzzled and were very suspicious about his story, so they decided to contact the police and get them involved in this situation. The police questioned Joseph, and again, he told them the same story and that he does not know anything aside from the information left by her daughter in a note. So the police decided to make a public appeal to Elisabeth. The police were asking Elisabeth to show up at the hospital so they can have Kirsten's proper medical history in order to save her life. And surprisingly, after a week, Elisabeth showed up in the hospital with Joseph. The doctors observed that her skin was in the same condition as Kirsten and that she looks way older for her age. She has this very pale skin and white hair. They started to question Elisabeth, and all she told them was that she was able to escape from the cult that she was in. She looked very timid, kept her head bowed down most of the time, and often looked at her father before talking. The investigators then decided to question Elisabeth and Joseph separately. During their separate interviews, they were telling the investigators the same story that they had been telling them earlier. But the investigators had enough. They pushed Elisabeth more and threatened her that if she does not tell them the truth, they will charge her for child abuse and will be sent to jail. And so, Elisabeth was getting more pressured, and finally, she told them her horrifying story. On August 28, 1984, Elisabeth was home alone with her father, Joseph. Joseph was in the process of building a cellar in their basement and was about to get it done. The only thing that's left was to put a door for the cellar, and so he called Elisabeth to help him. Elisabeth was tasked to hold the door in place while Joseph drilled the screw to the hinges of the door. After they were done, Elisabeth turned around and was about to get back up the stairs when suddenly, Joseph held her and covered her mouth and nose with a cloth that was soaked in ether. Ether is a highly flammable chemical and when inhaled may cause dizziness, drowsiness, and even loss of consciousness. When Joseph held her from behind, she tried fighting back, but Joseph was stronger and the chemical she was inhaling was tranquilizing her. She then passed out and Joseph dragged her inside the cellar. Nobody knew, including his family, that Joseph was a psychopath. Going back to his early childhood, Joseph Fritzl was born on April 9, 1935. It was said that Joseph grew up with her mother and she regularly beat him and left him for hours in pain. At around 15 years old, he had a history in exposing himself to women and having aggressive behaviors and started to fight back against her mother. At the age of 21, he married Rosemary, and the two had 3 sons and 4 daughters, including Elisabeth. In 1967, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a young mother whom he followed to her house. He was imprisoned for only 18 months for his crime. Oddly, in Austrian law, after 15 years, they erase all the records of your criminal history. And so, Joseph had a clean slate. Joseph became a respectable electrical engineer and has always been successful at what he does. In 1978, he started to build a big cellar in the basement of his house. At that time, during the years of the Cold War, It was common for well-off families to build bunkers in the basement of their own homes, which they could use as shelter should bombings happen in their city. So it was not difficult for Joseph to secure the necessary building permits. He had this obsession with one of his daughters, Elisabeth. When Elisabeth was 11 years old, Joseph began abusing her. And when she turned 15, she ran away from home, but later on was found by the police and was returned back to her parents. When Elisabeth turned 18, she planned on leaving her family and will be living with her sister in another town. This made Joseph more worried in losing his control on Elisabeth, and this prompted him to finish his cellar fast. And on that fateful day, on August 28, 1984, Joseph successfully imprisoned Elisabeth in the basement of their house without anyone suspecting. When Elisabeth woke up, she found herself in a dark room with no windows. Joseph then forced her to write a letter stating that she had run away. With no other choice, and with her father threatening her, she wrote a note that stated she was tired of her family life and decided to live her life on her own. Back upstairs, her mother, Rosemary, grew more worried for her daughter. They reported her as a missing person right away, but a few days later, her letter arrived in the mail. They were convinced that this letter really came from Elisabeth because they recognized her handwriting. Joseph also made a statement to the police after receiving the letter that Elisabeth ran away and joined a cult, as she had been mentioning before. And so, in the next few years, nobody suspected anything about Joseph. Joseph began sexually abusing Elisabeth every day in the cellar without anyone else knowing. At first, she was tied to a chain in her bed, but when Joseph realized this came in the way of his abuse against Elisabeth, he took them off from her. Meanwhile, his wife Rosemary and the rest of his children were totally unaware of the evil and horror that continued to happen just underneath the floors of their own house. They had been used to Joseph always busy with work at the basement, so nobody really bothered to check on what he was working on down there. Eventually, after 2 years of traumatizing abuse, Elisabeth got pregnant. She suffered a miscarriage at 10 weeks, but 2 years later, she conceived again. As she was nearing the end of her term, she begged her father to bring her the medical care she needed, but all her father gave her was a pair of scissors, a disinfectant, and a book about childbirth. She gave birth to a total of 7 children, and in all 7, she gave birth all by herself. However, her 4th child died due to a respiratory infection just days after she gave birth. Unable to bring the baby out, Joseph burned the baby's remains right there in the basement. It's unthinkable how she was able to manage to go through it all. She had once thought about ending her life, but she found purpose and meaning to be alive because of her kids. In her own way, she taught them how to read and write, and all that she can teach to her kids, she did, wanting them to live as normal as possible. When she gave birth to her 5th child, Joseph saw how crowded they already were downstairs, so he thought of a plan. He would sneak in and take the baby out of the basement in the middle of the night, when no one else could see him, hide the baby somewhere outside near their door, and pretend like a random baby has been abandoned for them to take in. Then he would force Elisabeth to write down a letter saying the baby was her child and that she could no longer raise on her own as she could barely make ends meet. She asked in the letter if her parents could take care of her child and provide for the baby's needs. Elisabeth signed the letter hesitantly. She did not want to be separated from her child, but also knew it would be better for the child than being trapped down with them. Joseph took a letter and drove off to a far place where he would mail the letters back to their address. As soon as they opened the letter, Rosemary, her mother, immediately recognized her handwriting. However, not a single suspicion sparked out of this unusual situation. Rosemary and Joseph accepted and embraced their grandchild. The same thing happened with Elisabeth's 6th child and also with the 7th. And so, Elisabeth had 3 children downstairs with her and 3 upstairs. Apparently, it was all part of Joseph's plan to get Elisabeth pregnant with many kids. Joseph was very obsessed with her to the point that he wanted her reputation to be tainted so badly. He knew he could not keep her locked up in the basement forever, so he made sure that when the time came that her dark secret got exposed, no one else would want to have relations with Elisabeth because of her past. For Elisabeth, however, all she wanted was to just get out and break free from this vicious and never-ending cycle of abuse and terror. She could only care less for anything else, except that she and her 6 kids can live a quiet life away from her monstrous father. Yet her situation seemed hopeless, helpless to even save her children at the very least. This went on for 24 very long years, until Kirsten's desperate and worsening condition opened up an opportunity for a way out. When the investigators heard this, they were astonished and dumbfounded. All along, Joseph, a respectable man in their community, was in fact a disgusting monster who preyed on his very own daughter. Immediately, the police sought for the arrest of Joseph and put Rosemary, Elisabeth, and her children in protective custody. A series of DNA tests were performed and results showed that Joseph was indeed the biological father of Elisabeth's children. This strengthened Elisabeth's case against her father. The police gained access to the cellar in the basement, and what they discovered was extremely disturbing. In that basement were a total of 8 locked doors that one would need to go through before reaching the cellar where Elisabeth was locked up. The last door was small, probably half the size of a normal door, hidden behind a movable cabinet. This door, unlike the other doors, had a keypad lock which of course only Joseph knew the passcode to. Once you enter that small door, there is a very narrow hallway with thick walls of soundproofing material on both sides that leads to a small room where the kitchen is located. Then on the other side of the room was a bathroom with no door, so open that the toilet and shower can be seen from the kitchen. Further down the small aisle was another narrow hallway filled with soundproofing material, which now leads into a small room that had another door at the corner, leading to another small room. The entire cellar had a low ceiling and poor ventilation. Even the investigators who just walked through could not wait to get out of that dark and eerie cellar. Without a doubt, building the cellar took 6 long years of detailed planning and execution. It was indeed carefully thought of. In the case proceedings, Joseph's lawyers attempted to defend him by saying he was not the monster that everyone had pictured out to be. Instead, he was simply an overprotective father who wanted to shield his child from bad influence and in his desperation, resorted to locking his daughter in the basement. The prosecution presented, on the other hand, a tape recording of their interviews with Elisabeth detailing all that she had experienced under the abuse of his ruthless father. Her stories were so horrifying that the jurors had to break the 11 hours worth of recording to a maximum of 2 hours per session only. Eventually, to strengthen their case and secure a heavier verdict for Joseph, Elisabeth went on the witness stand, all covered up as she did not want people to see her. It was then that Joseph pleaded guilty for every charge, but despite this, he has consistently shown no remorse. Elisabeth and her children underwent therapy for the extremely traumatizing years they have spent in that dark cellar. They went on to live their lives away from anyone who knew them. Barely anyone knew of their exact location, but it has been reported that they now live under strict security. The house got sold for €160,000 or $175,000 in 2016 and was converted into multiple apartments. Elisabeth Fritzl was sentenced to lifetime imprisonment with no possibility of parole for 15 years. By 2024, he would become eligible for parole if proved to be sane, with good standing, and no longer pose a threat to the community. The staggering contrast between 15 fixed years of imprisonment and the 24 long and grueling years of abuse and isolation goes to show the injustice that most people face until today. There will never be enough payment for his crimes, but Elisabeth's sole and most important consolation is the rest of their remaining years in the outside world. Thank you for making it this far. If you liked this video, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more of these horrifying stories. We appreciate all your support. Again, thank you and we'll see you on the next one.